Hey everyone, and welcome to this thrilling episode of OPG Live. I said thrilling this time instead of exciting.
That's right.
Yeah, trying to spice things up a bit, make it a little bit more exciting. Oh, I just did it again. I am your host, professional photographer Ian Plant.
I am Leah Zahner. I'll be your moderator today.
And welcome to the episode. Today, I'm going to look back at some of the photos that I have taken throughout 2019. I mean, I can't believe that the year is almost over.
We're there.
Yeah, I mean, just a few more, 2 weeks, and then it's
Yes.
done, and then we're in 2020. So that'll be pretty exciting. But 2019 was a great year, and I did a lot of photography. So I'm going to look back at some of my favorite photos. And then we're going to open the episode to questions from you, the viewer. So I'm here to help in any way I can to help make you a better photographer in 2020.
Woo!
Yeah. There's nothing I can do for you for the rest of 2019. We can only help you in 2020 now.
That's right. Fast forward right to January.
So Leah, you've got a few announcements, I'm sure?
I do. Before we get started with the Q&A session, today's live Q&A is sponsored by Tamron, and we are also bringing your attention to a free digital download. So you can take a peek. It is 7 ways to immediately improve your photography, and it's by photographer David Johnston. It covers construction, composition techniques, your gear, and even the weather. And you can look for the free guide by clicking the banner underneath your video or the link in the description while you're watching this live Q&A. We're going to move into some photos. I, as always, am going to keep a peek here to see if you have any questions that are applicable to the photo we're looking at right at the moment. Otherwise, I'll just keep track of what's coming in, and at the end of the session, we'll get to as many questions as possible to finish out 2019.
And remember, if you have questions that are really funny, there's a greater chance that they will be read online live. So try to spice things up a little bit.
Challenge issued.
Yeah. All right, so let's see. 2019 was an interesting year photographically. I didn't get to travel as much internationally as I would have liked, but I did get out and about quite a bit, as always. And I started off the year going up to Lake Superior. So those of you who live in the Midwest like we do might know that Lake Superior is actually kind of a landscape photography hotspot, though it's a bit underrated and not as many people know about it. Actually, I guarantee that there's a lot of people living in the Midwest area who don't know how incredible Lake Superior can be. It is one of my favorite landscape locations in the world, and it is got a lot of unique photo opportunities. And my favorite times to go up there and photograph are in the summer when it's warm enough to get out on my sea kayak and explore. I also like being there in the fall during the peak fall color. There's incredible fall color up in the upper Midwest around Lake Superior. And then winter. Winter is actually an exceptional time to go do photography on Lake Superior, though it's a bit more challenging because there are a lot of cliffs and islands that have caves that are along the shore of Lake Superior, but you've got to be able to get out to these areas where these ice caves form. So these caves, basically during the winter, there's a lot of water seeping down through the top of these sandstone caves, and that water seeping down forms these giant icicles. And so you get these really incredible ice cave formations, but it can be a little challenging to get out to these spots. So I've got a few of my favorite spots. One of my top spots for doing ice cave photography along the shore of Lake Superior is in the town of Munising in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan along the Pictured Rocks lakeshore. And Pictured Rocks is an area where you've got these giant 100 and 200 foot cliffs that come right down to the water. And there is all of this water that's seeping down these cliffs. That's where Pictured Rocks gets its name, because the water seeps through minerals that stain the cliffs all these fantastic colors. And in the winter, all that water turns into giant ice formations. So it's a really cool place to go. So I was up there this at the early part of the year to do some winter photography. It was very, very cold. But the lake, a good portion of the lake in that area froze. The great thing about Munising is it's located on a bay, and that bay often freezes over, even though the open water of Lake Superior might not freeze over unless it's really, really cold. So you can use the ice that forms on and near the bay to get out and explore some of these really cool caves. And so this first photo was a cave that I went and explored. I walked for several miles along the shore over the ice. and found a bunch of small caves. Actually, they are relatively big caves in the summer, sandstone caves, but so much ice was forming inside the caves that there wasn't a lot of space left. So for this shot, I had to crawl on my belly like a snake. I slithered into the ice formations within this really tiny cave, and then with a wide angle lens, I set up from the inside of the cave looking out through this forest of icicles. Now, they look like they're giant. They look like ice trees maybe, but actually they're quite small. I think that these icicles were maybe no more than a foot, some of them 2 feet tall. It's just that I had a really close perspective with a super wide angle lens, and that's what makes them look so big in this composition because they were so close to my lens. So this is the shot I took from the inside looking out. I like these sorts of perspectives when I'm making landscape photography. I like having darkness at the edges and the corners of the image, transitioning to getting progressively lighter in the center of the composition. That helps hold the viewer's eye within the composition and pulls them into the center of the composition. So I'm often looking for these types of transitions and these types of compositions. Now, there are a number of really big caves that you can find along the shore here because there's so many cliffs. And sometimes you'll have a cave proper, sometimes it'll just be an overhanging cliff or something like that. But some of these cave openings are 50, 60 feet tall, and you get these giant icicles that come down in the winter. The ice climbers love going there and climbing on these icicles. And this is actually not a ice climber in the photo. This is me in the photo. This is a self-portrait. I'm going to kind of zoom in. You can see that I do have an ice axe, and I'm pretending to climb the ice, but my ice climbing days are long over. I'm no longer spry enough to get up the ice. But I do like to pretend that I'm much more manly than I really am when I'm making self-portraits. So I put on my puffy down jacket to look like I had muscles, and I went out there and I sucked in my gut and puffed out my chest and set up this composition. And it was a lot of fun shooting this because I had the wide angle lens set up within the cave, and I had to do a lot of back and forth to get the right position and to work out where my shadow was going to be in the shot and to set up the composition so I could use that shadow creatively. And the camera was probably about 20 feet away from where I was standing in this photo. So I'd run over on this slippery ice to trigger the shutter with a 10-second timer. And then I had 10 seconds to slide my way back and then to get into position and hold that position until the shutter was triggered. If I had some sort of electronic remote, I could have just done this remotely, but I didn't have anything with me at the time. So I had to do this the old-fashioned way, running back and forth. So it's actually a great way to get in shape as you move back and forth. So once again, I shot this with a wide-angle lens, which is, you'll see that a lot with my landscape photography. And that's why the shadows in the foreground look so big and looming. And that's why, even though I'm much taller than those foreground shadows, in the background I look very, very small because the wide-angle perspective makes anything in the shot look smaller and farther away unless it's really, really close to the lens. So it allows you to creatively play with the relative size of objects in your compositions, allowing for a more dynamic visual design.
I've got a question that's come in
right.
already.
First question.
Actually, a comment and a question.
Okay.
Janice says, "You are so brave. I hate caves." So congratulations.
Yes.
You're brave, working out in the caves, doing a lot of good stuff.
I don't hate caves, but caves hate me.
Ooh.
Yeah, so.
Well, that leads us right into the question from Charles. Charles is asking, how stable is the ice in the caves? Do you worry about collapse, and what kind of precautions do you take?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. The ice is stable. I mean, when you're there when it's very cold, there's not much of a chance that the ice is going to break and come down. I think the riskiest times would be when it gets warmer, like in the spring, and that's when the ice starts breaking away from the rock and coming down in big chunks. But that said, you can go there and see big chunks. So what I do when I'm passing underneath the ice, I try to find a place where I don't have a bunch of jagged ice daggers overhead that might fall on me. And if I can't find a safe place to pass through, I just pass through as quickly as possible. It's highly unlikely that something's going to fall, but if it is going to fall, I want to make sure I'm getting through quickly as possible, because if it does fall, you do have a little bit of time before you get out of the way. So if you're passing through and you're only under the ice for a split second, there's very little risk that anything is going to ever happen to you. So it's something that I keep in mind, but I've never actually seen a chunk of ice fall when it was really cold out. The only time I've seen ice come down is in the spring when temperatures start to warm up, gets above freezing, and then I see these big chunks of ice coming down, and that's pretty scary to watch.
All right, one final question that just popped in. A guest is asking, can you share the camera settings that you used for that particular shot?
Yeah, so let me see if I can remember correctly. I probably was at f11. My focal length, I'm guessing, was 11 millimeters on a full frame camera. So this is an ultra wide perspective. And probably ISO 100. I try to use the lowest ISO I can to maximize quality. And the sun was in the shot, so this was actually a pretty bright exposure. So I'm not sure what the shutter speed was, but I'm guessing it was probably like 1/100th of a second or something like that, because it was relatively bright out when I took the shot. And when you're taking a shot that includes the sun with a wide-angle lens, you want to use a relatively small aperture like f11 or f16 to get that really nice starburst effect. And you can see that in the shot. I'll just kind of zoom in and show it to you. So every lens will create a different type of starburst. The lens I was using is one of those that has like a 16-point starburst. Like, I haven't gone in and counted, but it's probably something like 16 or 18 points in this star. Other lenses will do less points than that, so they all do it differently. But usually there's one common consistent thing. You have to stop down to a relatively small aperture to make that sun star look good. So a lot of people will use f16 or f22. I tend to avoid f22 because when you're using a really small aperture, you get this thing called diffraction, which actually reduces image quality throughout the entire image frame. So usually f11 or f16 I find is sufficient to make the sun star look good, but also avoid diffraction. All right, thank you very much for those wonderful questions. I have another ice cave image, and once again, this is me doing my very best to look like I'm a manly fellow and failing miserably. Wouldn't you say, Leah?
Oh, I wouldn't necessarily say that.
Yeah, come on. You can say, I know it's true. So, and you can see once again the starburst effect. So using a small aperture like f11 or f16. And I'm always thinking creatively about the shapes that are formed by objects and that are formed by the interaction of light and shadow. So here we can see the basis of this composition. I'm just going to go into the edit, and then I'm going to go into markup so I can just show you guys Oops, we'll use a different color. So this was, really this triangle is the basis of this composition. And I also had some interesting lines coming in from the light peeking through the icicles. So you get these lines that help lead the eye into the composition, and also the shadows coming in. These things can all be used creatively when you are making composition. So I'm always thinking about the shape, I'm always thinking about the lines and the progression of visual elements in my compositions. So let's just go ahead and go back to the next photo.
Oh, before we move out of the caves, we did have one final question
that
came in. Well, it's especially for the ones in the caves. This one comes from Marek.
So it's a cave question. Is it cave related, or did a cave actually write into the program to ask a question?
I'm doubting that it is the cave that asked the question, but we'll leave it open. We don't know. Amazing photos. Just wondering what level of post adjustments are in your photos, especially the ones from the caves.
I'm not really a huge post-processing digital manipulator, so I do run all my raw files through some basic adjustments, but I'm not trying to turn night into day or vice versa or anything like that. So I would say on a scale of 1 to 10 that I'm probably coming in maybe at about a 2 when it comes to digital darkroom work, very minor work just to optimize contrast and color and to bring out the best of the original photo, but without changing or altering the scene in a significant way.
All right.
Okay. Actually, people are really disappointed when they see my digital processing. I've had people like on photo workshops who, when I show them what I do, they look like they don't believe me. They're like, "That's it? No, you're lying." And I'm like, "No, really. Like, I'm a photographer. I'm not a photo manipulator. So I work hard to get it right in the field as much as I can. And I just use the digital darkroom process to subtly tweak and to optimize the image. I wouldn't even say enhance. Like a raw file is not a final product. It's not meant to be the final image. You have to apply some processing to it. You have to make some creative choices about contrast and color and saturation and all that. but I try to keep it all within the realm of the reality that was captured through the photographic process. I don't want to turn it into something that it wasn't. I don't believe in, I don't believe in using the digital darkroom to create the magic of the photo. I believe that you should be capturing that magic in the field and then just using the digital darkroom to subtly optimize the photo. Okay?
You have some agreement popping in on that one.
All right.
Good philosophy.
So yeah, I did a lot of fun stuff in the ice caves. I had plenty of shots from that. Those were just a few of my favorites. I also spent a lot of time in Utah, a little place in the Utah desert that's one of my favorite places out there. And it's not a national park, so there's no one there. And it's just in the middle of a bunch of national parks, but it's just random BLM land, Bureau of Land Management land. So there's more cows than people there. And it really is some of the most stunning desert in the world, and I love going to this particular spot. And I love the fact that I almost never see other photographers there. And this is a little composition of mine that I've been working on for a while. I found these cliffs, and as you walk into the cliffs, these cliffs, they come out on both sides, and they end up creating this V shape, which is really interesting. And that V shape only emerges when you walk in and stand in the right place looking up with a wide-angle lens. And I was there one morning actually with a workshop group, and we got lucky because we were setting up there to catch the first light of sunrise on the cliffs. And it was a clear day, but then some clouds started building right over the cliffs, and they came up right above the cliff, and they filled that sky space in between the V of the cliff just perfectly. So every now and then you get lucky and conditions come together and work out. And you can see that there's a figure in the photo. I decided that a human element was something that would help spice up the overall composition, and I wanted to repeat that V shape, so I ran into the shot, and of course that's me. And this is the best side of me, the side that's facing away from the camera. I look much more attractive when you can't actually see my face. So that's what I did for this particular photo. So I got lucky, conditions worked out, I got the shot. This is a composition that I'm gonna try to work with again in the future. I'm gonna do some different things with it. It's something that I really like. When you find a good composition, when you find a place, a piece of scenery that you really like, I think it pays to go back to that spot over and over again to try different things, because it really is those few good compositions that you find that will rise up above the rest of your work. So when you find something good, just grab onto it and don't let go. Bite into it like a pit bull would bite into a steak, and just don't let go. So that's my philosophy in photography. Find something that you really like, something that speaks to you, something that's powerful compositionally, and then just keep working it until you bring it to its fullest potential and get an amazing shot there that's going to make everyone else jealous.
We've got a question regarding composition here from Mardik again.
Okay.
When you compose what you photograph, do you select it by looking left and right, or do you do this all through the viewfinder?
Usually I start off just kind of wandering around without the camera, but I find that it helps when you're really trying to figure out what the final composition is going to be. You have to look through the viewfinder, or use the live view screen on your camera, either way. And part of the reason why I think it's really helpful to do this is that we perceive the world in 3 dimensions, but the final photograph is going to flatten the world down to 2 dimensions, and that actually makes things look different. You have to keep in mind, you have to take into consideration the fact that some objects may look different to your eyes in 3 dimensions, but when the world's squished down to 2 dimensions, they're going to appear to be overlapping or blocking each other. So I think it helps to get your eye behind the viewfinder, because then you get that flattened perspective, and it gives you a better sense. Also, it gives you a sense of what's in and what's out of the composition. When you're just walking around looking at everything, you can see everything, and it's kind of hard to mentally divide what's going to be in, what's going to be out. But when you use the viewfinder or switch on the live view screen, then you know exactly which visual elements are actually within the composition and which are falling outside of the image frame.
One more question directly about that photo. A guest is asking, how do you find the perfect balance in a shot like this between the land and the sky?
Oh, we could talk about that for a long time, finding the perfect balance in your compositions. So I guess some quick advice would be that, for my landscape work, what's going on in the sky is really, really important. If there's nothing going on in the sky, if there's no clouds, I probably won't include much of the sky at all. But if there's something really interesting going on, if there's a shape formed by the clouds and that shape is important to my composition, I'm going to want to give the the sky enough real estate in the composition so that that shape is going to be properly represented. So going back to this photo, for example, you can see that I've got this curving shape of the cloud in the sky, and I wanted to include that whole shape within the composition. So I gave the sky probably almost half of the space in the composition so I could include that entire shape. If I had, had less sky, I would have lost that shape, and I think it would have been much less effective. So I don't really worry too much about where the horizon's going to fall. That's not my primary concern. I'm looking at the shapes formed by objects in the sky like the clouds. I'm looking at the shapes that are formed by the landforms in the foreground, and I'm trying to find the right balance between those shapes and to have those shapes work together. And then once I figured out that, then the horizon is just going to fall wherever it may. Okay, so the next photo takes us back to Lake Superior, and this is one of those ice caves, except in the summer it's just a cave. And this cave is actually really more of an overhanging alcove. And I made this photograph there. I had to take a boat out to get out to this spot. It's several miles away from the shore on an island, and then I kayaked into to this spot for sunrise. And I set up on the cobble beach, and I used that as the foreground of my wide-angle composition. And then I went wide enough to include a lot of that sandstone alcove, and I was lucky to get a really brilliant sunrise going on in the background, so I photographed that. This was a shot that actually took multiple exposures to capture the range from light to dark. There was a lot of contrast in the scene. Inside the cave, it was very dark, so I wanted to have some detail in the interior of the cave. So I took several exposures and blended them together, doing merge to HDR in Adobe Lightroom. Actually, I don't use Adobe Lightroom. I use Adobe Camera Raw, but it's pretty much the same thing. So I used the merge to HDR program there so that I could reveal some of the detail in the shadows, but still preserve all that brilliant color in the sky. And this photo is actually hanging on the wall in the gallery of the newly opened Gallery Coffee Company in Munising, Michigan. Munising isn't well known as being a beacon for the fine arts, but it's becoming that, and this new facility is incredible. So if you haven't been to Munising in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, I recommend that you go check it out. It's a really great place. It's where the Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore is. It's where all these amazing sea caves are and all these beautiful stained cliffs. And culture is coming to Munising. The Gallery Coffee Company is a cool place to get a nice cup of coffee and to see some amazing local art. Just beautiful photographs. So this particular image is printed about wall size. So I'd say it's maybe like 30 feet across and about 15 feet high. So it's pretty cool walking in there and seeing this photograph displayed really big. So
Jesse's got a question about this photo.
All right.
Jesse's asking, how did you keep the foreground so crisp while also getting the sunrise and the trees clear?
Okay, well, so this question comes up pretty much every time we do a live event. And it involves certain things. There's something called hyperfocal distance, which is one way of focusing so that you get near and far in a wide-angle shot very sharp. And hyperfocal distance is, if you focus on the nearest point in your composition, you're wasting your depth of field. Your background's going to be out of focus. If you focus on your background, vice versa, your foreground's going to be out of focus. So you have to focus somewhere in between those two extremes and then stop your aperture down using a small aperture to extend your zone of depth of field, that zone of apparent sharpness, from near to far. So for a shot like this, what I would do to set the hyperfocal distance is I estimate the distance from my camera lens to the nearest object in my composition. So let's say these rocks are 3 feet away. What I would do is then focus on a point that's double that distance. So I'd actually focus on a point that was 6 feet away, and then I'd stop down to a small aperture like f11 or f16, and that would extend that zone of apparent focus to the foreground rocks and to everything in the background as well. Another thing you can do, if you want to take the guesswork out of it, a lot of people, including myself, use a technique called focus stacking, which involves taking multiple shots. It's the same shot. You don't change your exposure. You don't change the composition. You just change your focus point, and you focus on the near element. You focus on something in the middle. You focus on whatever is farthest away. And then on the computer, using a focus stacking program like Helicon Focus, you can merge those together. So that's a great way of making sure everything is sharp without having to worry about all of this hyperfocal distance stuff and trying to figure out what aperture to use. So it gets you into the same place, but it just takes some of the guesswork out of it. And it allows for an overall sharper image, because I said earlier, as you stop down to really small apertures, you may be extending your depth of field, so the zone of apparent sharp focus gets bigger. But with a small aperture, this optical defect called diffraction actually reduces overall image quality. So with a really small aperture like f16 or f22, you have a lot of depth of field. You have a lot that looks like it's in focus, but increasingly, anything that's in focus will just be a little bit less sharp than it would have been if you were using a bigger aperture like f11 or f8. So focus stacking takes that diffraction element out of it. So overall, it can allow you to get much sharper images. And if you're interested in learning more, you can check out my course here on the OPG shop, Focusing for Landscape Photography, which tells you everything you need to know about focus stacking, about hyperfocal distance, and a bunch of stuff you really don't want to know. But I guarantee you, after you're done with it, you'll be able to focus things perfectly each and every time. All right. The next photo takes us down to the high-altitude desert of Argentina, a region called the Puna. And I was down there earlier this year in July, late June and early July, to photograph the total solar eclipse. And the desert there is incredibly beautiful. So the eclipse, it was actually my second solar eclipse. I did an eclipse a few years back. I think it was 2017 in the US. And my eclipse shots then were better. Like, this eclipse wasn't quite as robust as the one in 2017. But I had a great time photographing in the Puna region because it's incredibly beautiful. You're up at like 14,000 feet. So this is a place that will literally and figuratively take your breath away. And with this photo, there were all these thermal pools, basically these geothermal pools that had different color because of the bacteria inside of them. And there must have been dozens of these pools scattered through this one area in the desert in this salt pan. And I flew my drone above the pools with the camera pointed down. And this is one particular shot. I found these really colorful pools that were all together that seemed to form like a face. So you can see the two eyes, and then you've got that streak of white in the middle that kind of looks like a nose. I mean, it's a pretty ugly face. It's a very asymmetrical face, kind of like mine. So yeah, it's like a mirror image for me. This just gives you an idea of like how really cool this area is. And I did a lot of photography when I was in the Puna. Here's another aerial shot with my drone. These desert environments are just great for drone photography. So I flew my drone as much as I could to get some really compelling perspectives. And this is a feature called a Rita cone. And it is just a big brown hill that's coming out of this salt pan. And it's got this really nice cone shape. And I photographed this at sunrise. It was catching that first light that was hitting the hill and lighting up the salt pan. And this big shadow went off on the opposite side of where the sun was rising. So with my drone looking down at a Rita cone, I was able to capture the light on the cone and the shadow going off into the distance to get this particular shot. So it's nice and colorful. I've got that warm sunrise light, and then I've got the blue of the salt pan in the shadow. And I really like the simple shape here as well. You get the triangle of the cone and then the triangle of the shadow. And here's another shot from the desert down there. This is a place that's called the Devil's Desert, or the Red Desert, or the Labyrinth Desert. It's got a lot of names. And it's got these incredible red hills, these bentonite clay hills. And it's really an interesting landscape. And one very frigid morning, I flew my drone up high in the sky, looking down at the hills in the foreground. I've got some other hills in the distance, and then you see the snow-clad mountains in the background, and then the morning twilight sky completes the composition. So it's a really beautiful place. I love going down there, and what's great about it is that you don't really get a lot of tourists down there. You certainly don't get a lot of photographers. There's not a lot of people that know about this area, but it's a really super cool place, and I love going down there. Another place I went to this year was Greenland. I was there in the first 2 weeks of August to photograph icebergs. And once again, I was doing a lot of work with my drone. You may recall from a few episodes back, I had an ugly scar on my chin because I got hit by my drone at one point. It was like Rise of the Machines, Skynet, Terminator. It just, decided it wanted to murder all humans and to start with me. So it was a lot of fun. But I had a great time making photographs in Greenland. I was out on a boat looking for icebergs, so launching and landing the drone from the boat was rather difficult for many reasons. But it was great to be able to send the drone up around the icebergs because you could get some really interesting perspective. So this is an absolutely giant iceberg, and I flew above it. And you can see that there was a partial collapse, so there's some ice that's flowing away from the iceberg in the bottom of the image frame. And here's a shot I took from the boat with a wide-angle lens of an iceberg. So this was a water level perspective, not using my drone. And I love the wide-angle perspective because you can get really close to an interesting foreground and make it look a lot bigger, and you can shrink the size of your background, creating this narrowing of perspective that helps draw the eye in. And I got lucky for this particular shot because there were some great clouds, and they formed a shape in the sky that complemented the curving shape that's in the foreground. So there was, basically a partial collapse of ice off the iceberg, and all these ice floes were drifting in the water. And so I had the captain of the boat drive back and forth while I would wait for something interesting in the foreground. So I was looking for some nice ice flows in the foreground. And as I was moving along, I noticed this hole in the ice where all of the little bits of ice were floating around. So I waited until that lined up beneath the iceberg in the distance, and that creates a curving shape that complements the curving shape of the cloud in the sky above. So I'm always thinking critically about the shapes, and when you do wide-angle photography with landscape work, you can work with these shapes very creatively. All right, the next photo is another iceberg in a different part of Greenland. There was this big mountain in the background, and I took this shot at sunrise. Of course, sunset, sunrise, that time of year is all pretty much the same thing. It just kind of seamlessly blends into one. It never really gets dark. And towards the beginning of the trip, it was the midnight sun. Like, the sun didn't set. Towards the end, the days were definitely beginning to get shorter, and there would actually be several hours between sunrise and sunset. But it never even got dark at all. So it would be twilight for that whole time, but it would be completely bright out. So it was really surreal being out there at 2 or 3 in the morning, and it looked like it was maybe, 7 p.m. So it was kind of interesting. And after I'd get done shooting in the morning, after quote-unquote sunrise, I'd go back to my hotel, and I would shut the blinds as tight as I could, and I'd put on a blindfold and sleep during the brightest part of the day. So that was a little weird. But this shot was, once again, taken with my drone. So I really loved the fact that the drone could basically get the camera into any position that I needed to get the composition I wanted. It helped a lot when photographing these icebergs because it was very tricky with a boat to get into a good position. And of course, you could only move left or right. You couldn't set up higher or lower when you were in the boat. So the drone allowed me to get that higher perspective as necessary to open up the shapes, open up the compositions, and to get the visual designs that I wanted. And I did a lot of photography. I probably ended up with like 50 or 60 really good iceberg shots from this trip. And that's a really productive trip for me. And here's a shot of an iceberg that had a partial collapse, and these were the ice flows drifting away from the iceberg, creating some really interesting shapes in the water that I used as part of my composition. Here's another shot of an iceberg taken with a drone. This had a really great shape to it, and I made this photograph at sunset when there was some really warm, colorful light on one side of the berg. And I chose a position with my drone so that I had the colorful light on one side, but you can see the shadowed side a little bit as well. So you've got that contrast in color. Everything that's in shadow ends up going blue because that's not being lit by the sun. That's just getting light reflected from the blue sky. And that's why anything that's in a shadow is going to look cooler in color. So I've got the contrast between the cool blues of the iceberg in shadow versus the really warm, colorful light of sunset on the side of the iceberg that was still in the light. So I like this shot because of that simple graphic shape of the iceberg and the contrast of the colors. And I also did some photography in Badlands National Park in South Dakota, which is one of my favorite places to make landscape photos in the world. It's just a really cool, quirky place. And it can be a challenging place to do landscape photography. That's why I do most of my landscape photography masterclass workshops there, because there's a lot of great raw materials to work with. You really have to learn how to put together a landscape composition to get successful shots in the Badlands. But all the raw materials are there. You've got all of this eroded landscape creating all these shapes, and there's all these colors there. And so you can work with these raw materials and learn how to put together compelling landscape photos. These techniques will allow you to make great landscape photos anywhere in the world. And so that's why I really love doing these workshops out there. I do have one in April coming up, by the way. If you want to learn more about it, just go to my website, ianplant.com. Sorry, my throat's getting a little dry here. I just spent 2 days filming a course, so I was speaking the whole time, so my voice is almost completely shot. But in any event, if you want to learn more about my masterclass workshops, just go to ianplant.com and click on the workshop links. I've got a few workshops for 2020 that still have some openings, so check it out. But in any event, this is a composition in the Badlands that I have had set up for years. It's a fun little composition, but I've never had the right light for it. So finally, I had a morning this year where I got some good color during the morning twilight. So there's some clouds in the sky that are lighting up a little bit pink, and I had some nice soft glow from the twilight sky lighting up the landforms in the background. So I was able to successfully complete this composition, something that I've been sitting on for about 2 years now. So it's what I said earlier, when you find a really good composition, it's a good idea to keep working it until you finally get the light that you like. So I was pretty happy with the light that I got here. It came together really nicely, but it's not perfect, so I'll probably end up going there again in 2020 and hoping for an even more incredible sunrise. But what I like about this shot, let me just go into the editing here, and we'll mark this up, is the shape here formed by the foreground. There's this formation that creates this sort of U shape or this V shape that sends these lines into the composition, and that helps point the viewer deeper into the composition. And then you also have the gully down below, which creates this S-curve that brings the eye deeper into the composition. And then I really like the central shape, that big triangle in the background. All of these things work together to encourage the viewer to go from the lower corners and edges of the composition into the central interesting part of the composition. So I like to have, as I said earlier, those tonal transitions, dark to light, and also a visual progression that leads the eye from the edges and the corners into the central part of the composition and holds their attention over time. So that's why I like that particular composition, and that's why I'm probably going to end up going back at some point, because I want an even more exciting sky in the background. So I'm going to keep going until I get it right. And I think this is the final shot that I'm going to share. This goes back to Argentina, to the Puna region. And one of my favorite places in the Puna is this beautiful, way out of the way remote place called the pumice stone field. And it's called the pumice stone field because there are these giant blocks of pumice. There was a volcano eruption tens of thousands of years ago that spread these giant blocks of pumice over this area, and they go on for miles and miles and miles. I mean, I think the pumice stone field is something like 40 miles across. I mean, it's absolutely huge. And the pumice is soft, so it's been steadily eroded by the wind over the past few thousand years. And the wind is able to erode it so effectively because a lot of times the wind is picking up sand. So during a sandstorm, that wind will erode that soft pumice, kind of like water will erode rock over time. And when you actually look at this area from above, it looks like a giant riverbed or something like that that's being steadily eroded. But it's not water, it is sand in the air carried by the wind that's doing all the erosion. So it's really stunning to see this similar erosion pattern that you might get if you had water, just basically the result of flying sandpaper, I guess. But it's a really cool place because you get these pumice stone formations rising out of this black volcanic sand. And I'm always on the lookout for, as I said earlier, this visual progression that takes the eye from the edge into the center of the composition. So for this particular shot, I had these ridges, these ripples in the black sand, and a finer gray sand, like a whitish sand, was on top of the ripple crests, and that created this contrast and this really nice pattern that helps lead the eye deeper into the composition. And I photographed this during the morning twilight, so there's a little bit of a twilight glow in the sky going on in the background. Once again, would have been better if I had like some super interesting shapes of clouds in the sky catching some really strong light at sunrise. So you can guarantee that I'm going back to the pumice stone field again. Every time I go there, I find new shots, and really what I'm looking for at this point is just to find the best compositions and then to wait for really stunning light to bring it all together.
All right, we've got Crafty Panda with a comment that I was thinking myself.
Crafty Panda, I love it.
Pumice stone field, great for exfoliation.
Yes, it is. So I guess the best thing to do when you go there is just to lay down on the ground and kind of, wriggle around like a snake and just, exfoliate everything.
A very simple spa day.
Actually, I was out there during a sandstorm, and you don't even need to wriggle around on the pumice stone. You just stand out there when the sand is blowing in the air, and everything gets exfoliated off you right away. Like, your face gets exfoliated off because the sandstone is so harsh. Yeah, I guess that's not pleasant.
Well, I don't know if it would be very enjoyable.
No, but it would be super deep exfoliation.
Well, we do have about 20 minutes left with our Q&A session, so I'm going to start to go back up into, if you put a question in already that we haven't gotten to, rest assured, I'm scrolling back up so we can get to as many as possible.
Okay.
And of course, keep them coming in. General questions to finish out the year will be great. Going all the way up to McMoose.
I love these names.
McMoose is asking, Ian, what are some desert composition tips? Is it hard to make all that sand interesting, or are you able to find patterns and interesting elements easily?
So sand, I love sand. Sand makes everything so much easier because you often get really interesting shapes in the sand. So if you think about, your average sand dune in the desert, you're going to get ripples, you're going to get crests on the top of the dune. So there's a lot of really great shapes, but those shapes are only revealed in strong angled light. So the best time to photograph a sandy scene is at sunrise and sunset, when you've got that first 20 or 30 minutes after sunrise, or that 20 or 30 minutes before sunset. You've got low angled light creating all these deep shadows, so it's revealing all of the texture. And once you can see the ripples in the sand, or you can see the crests on the top of the dunes, you can do a lot of really creative things with the composition. But as the sun gets higher, so like at sunrise, you've got that short period of time where you've got that really strong light, and it's really colorful light. But as the sun gets higher, the light loses that bright, that really strong, warm color. It starts getting whiter and whiter. And then you also lose the shadows. As the sun is overhead, shining down into those ripples, you lose all of those patterns and those shapes. So my best advice is to be there during sunrise and sunset. Hope that you have actually pretty clear skies, because you want really strong light, really colorful light, and then you can work with all the shapes that emerge from the ripples. You get great leading lines, you get these great curves that are created by the light on the crests of the dunes. So that in-between period where you've got that angled light, creating a lot of shadows, revealing all these compositional shapes that otherwise don't appear to the eye. That's the best time to photograph sand dunes in the desert.
And take advantage of that, all right. George P. is asking, do you print any of your photos? Where is a good place to make quality prints?
So I don't print any of my photos. I used to a long time ago, but now there's so many really good digital labs out there that you're better off just sending your print to a lab. So there's a few labs that I use. My favorites are mpix.com, that's MPIX. They actually do a pretty good job. And then bayphoto.com, Bayphoto Lab. I think it's just bayphoto.com. Actually, they're my preferred vendor. I use them more than anyone else. But all these places are pretty good. As long as you've got a calibrated system on your end, when you send the files to the printer, what you see is pretty much going to be what you get. There's a little bit of variation because the print surface probably doesn't have as wide of a gamut than your computer does. So what you see on the screen, you might be able to see more colors and a little bit more contrast range on your screen than you can see in the final print. So it's not going to be perfect, but if you have a calibrated system on your end, then the final print that you get is going to look very, very close to what you see on your computer. So I definitely recommend it. Doing your own printing can be exceedingly frustrating. So it's something I used to do, but the truth of the matter is my favorite type of print is something called a metal print, which is a coated aluminum sheet. So the print is made on that aluminum, and you can't do that at home. So I don't even think about it.
All right, and our next question is coming in from a guest.
Hello, guest.
Do you use any artificial light on your travels?
So I don't tend to use artificial light with my landscape work. The only time I use artificial light is when I'm photographing wildlife or people. And so I'll often bring a flash with me, especially if I'm shooting wildlife. I like to shoot at sunrise and sunset and during the twilight when the light is low, and I'll use flash just to add a little bit of fill light to my subject and help the subject stand out from the background a bit. I like using the flash at low power. I found that if you're using it at full power, it just looks too obviously flashed. So what I like to do is shoot at a very low power so that the flash is just slightly brighter than the ambient light so that the subject stands out a little bit more from the ambient light, but not in an overwhelming way.
Okay, let's move on to Robert's question. Robert wants to know, can you say where that special place in Utah is?
I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you, Robert. No, it's okay. So it's a little town called Hanksville. And I'm pretty sure it's just named after some guy named Hank. There's not that many people that live there. And there's barely anything there. People who stop in Hanksville are usually just gassing up because they're going to Lake Powell, or they're going to Moab, or they're going to Capitol Reef National Park. So not a lot of people end up actually in Hanksville, but it's a stunning place. There's a lot of really great scenery there. And it's a lot of stuff that's not photographed a lot. So there's an opportunity to go out and make original. No one there, and it's legally permissible to fly there. And you might maybe bug a cow at some point. That's about it. I've been out there and not had a single human being within 10 miles, 15 miles of me in some of the places I've gone. And it's just been amazing. So
this actually ties into a question that Oliver fed through. Oliver was wondering, what are the most overcrowded photography hotspots?
Well, just about any national park. That's what I love about Badlands National Park, is that it's not a photography hotspot. Like you go to a place like Arches National Park or Yosemite or Grand Tetons, and you can go to places where there will literally be 300 photographers all fighting for one spot to get a picture. And it's the same picture that literally everyone is taken there. You go to Schwabacher's Landing in Grand Teton National Park, for example, and the thing about Schwabacher's Landing is that it was made famous by Ansel Adams, who took a photo there, a very good photo, decades ago. But in that intervening time, a lot has changed. The trees have grown up and now kind of block a view of the view of the mountains. The beavers have come in and they've dammed the water. And so it looks completely different than it did in Ansel Adams' time. It's not even good anymore. I think Schwabacher's Landing, photographically, is a really poor place to make photos. But every morning, you go there, there will be 300 or 400 people all fighting, literally, for maybe 1 or 2 spots where, if you stand in the right place, everything lines up there. But if you're not in the right place, you don't get the shot. So there's literally 300 or 400 people fighting over this one spot. It used to be you'd get up at 4 in the morning to go and get that spot. But now I'm pretty sure you've got to show up the night before and literally just stay out there all night. There's so many people fighting for that one spot. And it's absolutely bonkers. I hate photographing places like that. I cannot stand going to the icon spots. So I love going to a place like Badlands National Park because there's no photo icons. There's no half dome. There's no delicate arch. There's no Schwabacher's Landing. There's nothing there that stands up obvious. So all you need to do is kind of stop somewhere on the road and then just walk out into the wilderness, and you are going to find compositions that are completely original. You're not going to see any photographers around. Quite literally, as long as you avoid photographing from the pullouts, you probably won't see a single tripod anywhere near you when you're out there making photos. But it forces you to be original. It forces you to find compositions on your own instead of just setting up in the tripod holes of literally 1 million photographers who have come before you. So you have to know what you're doing or you're going to struggle and have a tough time. So yeah, most national parks are like Grand Teton. You know, most of them are going to be places where there are stand-up photo icons. But there's a lot of places, even in those famous national parks, and there's a lot of places in less famous national parks like Badlands where you can go and find completely original stuff. You know, so I tell that story about Schwabacher's Landing. I had a workshop group out there years ago, and me and another photographer, Joseph Rossback, a good friend of mine, were leading the workshop, and we told our clients, we are not going to Schwabacher's Landing. We absolutely refuse to take you there. And we explained why. We said there's just too many people there, and we told them we had another spot that's literally a quarter-mile away from Schwabacher's Landing that no one knows about, that is a beautiful open view of the mountains and a really great place to photograph. And our clients mutinied. They said, no, we came to photograph the famous icons. We want you to take us to Schwabacher's Landing. And we said, all right, we've got to get up at like 4 in the morning. And they were like, no, we don't want to get up that early. We told them, if we don't get there that early, you're not going to be able to shoot Schwabacher's Landing. So we dragged them out of bed at 4 in the morning, and they were all grumbling and cursing. And we show up at the parking lot, and there was already 60 cars there. And at that point, our clients turned to us and said, we get it now. We understand. Yes, we don't want to shoot here. Please take us to your other spot. We took them to this spot that was a quarter-mile away from this famous photo icon where I guarantee you that more, instead of averaging everything in the scene, the camera would only take an exposure from a specific spot chosen by the user. And you know, spot metering is really useful if you're photographing something, let's say a swan as it's flying in the sky. You want to make sure that that white swan is properly exposed, so you use the spot meter to meter off the swan itself. And you set your exposure according to what the meter's giving you. And that way, as the swan's moving around and you're panning with it, even if that background changes, so even if the background exposure changes, you always have that perfect exposure for the swan. So that's when spot metering would be useful. So center weighted metering is basically like a fat version of spot metering. So what it does is it kind of takes an average of everything in the scene, but it weights the exposure towards the middle area. So it's not quite taking a spot reading, but it's giving that middle spot more emphasis than the rest of the scene. And then finally, evaluative metering is a term used to describe some sort of smart algorithm. So it's taking readings throughout the entire image frame, but the algorithm, the AI, is trying to determine what is the most important part of the scene to be metering from. And so the camera's making some sort of predictive evaluation. And I mean, I don't know how it works exactly. So it's kind of like, it's not spot metering, it's not quite center weighted metering. It might be weighting part of the scene over another part, but that's up to the AI of the program, the algorithm, to figure out what gets the most emphasis. So that's, and you know, most people just kind of use the default evaluative metering. It's called different things on different camera platforms. I think the most common use of the spot metering, as I said, is for like wildlife photography or things like that. My advice, it doesn't really matter what kind of system you're using. That's your camera telling you what it thinks is the best exposure. You have to make creative choices about that exposure and use exposure compensation to increase or decrease the amount of exposure. And so what you need to do is, doesn't matter what kind of metering system you're using, take a test shot, look at the exposure, and then you make a decision whether you need to have the exposure brighter or darker. And then you can change your settings to get the proper exposure.
All right, let's do rapid fire. We have a little over a minute left. Okay, let's see what we can get that's really quick. Jules asks, how many memory cards do you take on a trip?
Just one, but it's really big.
All right, Janice is asking, in your experience, can you plan a great shot? That is, with enough research, patience, gear, etc. Can you craft a great shot no matter what?
Well, maybe not no matter what, but planning is very important, and I do a fair amount of research, but really the most planning that I do is getting out there, scouting, finding those good compositions, and then it's just waiting for the real world to align with the vision that's in your head. So sometimes you have to go back to that same spot 20, 30, 100 times until you get that perfect sunrise or sunset to make it all happen.
All right, Chevy Gun, viewing on YouTube, asks, what settings do you use to get the streaking taillights at night?
Well, you need to have a long exposure, and it really depends on how fast objects are moving and how much streak that you want. But let's say you're photographing like a highway and there's lots of cars moving by. Usually you want 4 to 8 seconds long to get that streak. If you go too much longer, then the cars might just completely disappear. So test different exposure times to get the proper one.
One final question, Frank F. Is Batman dressing up as Santa this year?
Ooh. Or is Santa dressing up like Batman? I don't know.
Who knows? I guess we'll all try to figure it out. There are some questions that we didn't get to this hour, but please hang on to them. We will be back with more Q&A sessions in 2020. Don't worry. Before I send it over to Ian for some final thoughts, just a reminder to follow us on social media. That's Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter, and Instagram. My name is Leah. I've been your moderator today and most of this year.
And I'm Ian Plant, and I guess I have to offer some final thoughts. My final thoughts are that remember, when you take a snapshot, you're showing the world what your camera sees, but you don't want to do that. You don't want to just go out there, point your camera, press the button, and hope something good happens. You want to be in control of the process. So make that your New Year's resolution as we wind down 2019 and go into 2020. You're going to take control of your camera, and you're going to show the world what you see. I'm Ian Plant, and thanks for watching. Bye.